This video is an overview of some of the techniques and tools I use when carving and texturing my wood turnings, and most of the techniques apply to both face grain and spindle projects. A large percentage of the carving and texturing I do occurs with the work mounted and the lathe running. Here I'm using a 3-point tool and making a series of light cuts across a broad rim. Using the same 3-point tool, here I am just putting the point in a little deeper and in essence making a series of simple V grooves along a broad rim. From those grooves, using the 3-point tool, it's very easy then to form nicely shaped beads. The 3-point tool is very effective at doing this. Of course, spear point tool is also similar. There's many other ways of making beads on face grain and end grain, but I found this is a simple way. Point goes in and this handle swung, and you form the left and right side of the bead. Here I'm using the double bevel cutter on the Sorby brand of texturing tool. Other manufacturers make similar tools. And I'm just moving that double bevel cutter laterally across the tool rest, and that creates what a lot of people call orange peel, but it's a pleasing texture. I think of this almost as embossing. Again, using the Sorby tool. In this case now I've turned the RPM down a little lower, and on an angle I'm using the single bevel cutter, and I'm making a series of cuts, and I'm changing the direction and the incline of that angle, and that'll create a series of cuts. Sometimes it's very random. It could be frustrating using that tool, but with practice you do start to get some nice results. And now again, going back to the 3-point tool, I'm making some V grooves, and that helps define those cuts. Here I'm using a long nose spindle gouge, and this is a method that a lot of professional wood turners would use to create beads on bowls. And it was taught to me by Richard Raffin, who popularized it. The technique is a little non-intuitive, but with practice it makes it very easy, and the advantage of this is that it leaves very little torn grain on the end grain section of a bowl. And it's, again, you start with the flute closed, and as you bring the nose up, it forms one half of the bead, and then when you bring it down, you form the other half. Carl Ford showed me this following technique using a scraper. He learned it from Al Sturt, and it's a great way to make large, wide grooves in face grain, especially. And it has a large burr on it, and you notice that it's angled high, so it's a high shearing angle. And you kind of use a scooping action, and it creates these really nice large wide grooves with very little torn grain. In most cases, when people think carving, they're thinking tools like this, hand tools. In this case, it's a V parting tool. Of course, it could also be a U-shaped gouge. And the process is, even with the very sharpest, and these are well-maintained and well-made tools, but it's not easy to do. Using a power reciprocating carver allows you to get that very nice clean cut with a lot less effort. But very often I find that using a rotary carver on a simple tool like a Dremel, in this case it's a shafted tool, with a rotary cutter is the best way to go. Makes pretty short work of making those V grooves. The downside is, though, very often you'll get a lot of fuzz, at least on one side of the cut. But the rotary cutters are something that's really worthwhile, and they come in a large variety. These happen to be solid carbide cutters, and there's some that cut 3 grooves at once, single grooves. In this case, this is an actual carbide cup cutter. So I thought it would be helpful if I showed the process by which I use simple tools, most of which you probably already own, and inexpensive accessories to actually make a, a carved and embellished platter in this case. So here you see I formed a bowl and a raised bead, and I'm using a spear point tool to define a narrow area next to that bead. For me, purchasing the Trent Bosch carving stand was definitely a game changer. Here I have it mounted on my outside bench. The beauty of it is your work is now stuck in the 4-jaw chuck, which is a great place for it in case it needs to get back on the lathe. So here I'm using an angle grinder fitted with a coarse sanding flap wheel. And by using the corner of that wheel, I'm able to make these deep V grooves in the outer rim. Again, the advantage of having the work mounted on your 4-jaw chuck allows me to put it back on the lathe. And in this case now I've just decided I wanted to make some radial lines using the tool rest as a guide, and that'll help me guide the next cuts. So now I'm just using a standard Dremel cutter. It's like a $4 cutter. It's the 115 and my Dremel tool. And again, the Dremel tool is maybe a $35 2-speed Dremel tool. And notice I keep my fingers, thumb and forefinger around that narrow portion of the cutter, of the Dremel. And I rest it on the work. And I'm using those earlier made lines that radiate out from the center. And I'm just going to continue around. And I'm trying to maintain that angle so that these make V cuts. Of course, again, very often, depending on where in the grain, you'll get a lot of fuzz and tear out. So in this case, I'm just using a drill-mounted wire wheel, and keeping in that same radial direction, I'm using it to smooth out and get rid of some of that tear out and fuzz. Up till now, most of the carving has been pretty bold, and I decided I want to do something much more delicate around this narrow area. So I decided to use a burner, and it's fitted with a nichrome wire coil that I made, and it leaves a series of fine lines. And I went around in this direction first. Then by turning the burner 90 degrees and applying the coil at pretty regular intervals, you could really create this nice basket weave effect. I like the contrast between the deeply carved radial lines and the dark burned basket weave pattern, along with the smooth interior of the bowl.